Hello, John Hall here from Here Pens. Today we're going to be looking at a very remarkable pen, very expensive, I suppose quite plain looking, but the virtue is all in the nib, and what we're looking at is the Sailor Ebonite King of Pen with a Naginata Togi nib, a medium fine Naginata Togi nib in this case. And during the course of the video, we'll have a go with it. We'll see how it writes. I'll tell you a bit about it, and I'll also tell you a little bit about the man who invented the Naginata Togi nib. Okay then, it's a big pen, and it comes in a big, rather nice box. Typical Japanese understatement, I think. There we go. So we have right, there's a little booklet that says a little bit about the Naginata Togi nib and Ebonite. There's not actually a certificate of authenticity as such, although the pen does rather speak for itself. You've got instructions here at great length about how to fill it and so forth. I strongly suspect that if you're in the market for one of these pens, you probably already know how to fill a fountain pen with a cartridge converter system. But there we go. Okay, so you get a bottle of ink, you get a cleaning cloth, you get some cartridges, and you also get this pen. Well, the first thing that we notice is that it is quite a large pen. There we go. And almost completely unadorned. I mean, this is the gold finish. It has a clip and very little else. And when we open it up, still relatively unadorned, although this absolutely beautiful nib. There we go. Now, obviously, it is a 21 karat gold nib, as all of Sailor's top-end pens are. Beautifully finished. I mean, it's gorgeous, isn't it? I could spend all day looking at this practically, but I'm not going to. What I'd like you to notice is, first of all, the very long tines. Okay, so that goes on for quite a long time. And that is what gives the nib a surprising and very pleasant degree of flexibility. Not a flex nib as such, but it's soft to a quite extraordinary degree. The other thing I would like you to notice, this is rather good. Okay, you see the shape of that? So, it's clearly got an awful lot of tipping on it, and there's clearly been quite a lot of work done on it to finish it like this. There we are. And the shape, if one was Japanese, certainly several hundred years ago, would immediately have put you in mind of the Naginata Togi, which is a weapon that was used by the infantry, where basically you would have a blade of that shape on a long pole, which would enable you to do a lot of damage to your enemies. Other things to look at, the feed, Ebonite of course, and the pen itself is Ebonite, and very nice too. Now, Ebonite is material that's much loved by pen makers. It's got a lovely warm feel to it. It's a rubber, it's a hard rubber. One of the reasons this pen hasn't been available for quite a long time is that Sailor apparently was struggling to find Ebonite of an appropriate quality to make their pens. Well, they do seem to have got there now. The other reason is to do with the nib. Have another quick look, eh? There we go. Now, that nib was developed by, I'm looking at my notes because I can never pronounce his name right. Mr Nobuyaki Nagahara. The Nagahara bit's okay, Nobuyaki. There we go, perfect. He was a very, very remarkable man. He was born, I think, in about 1932 in Hiroshima, which is where the Sailor Pen Company is based. When he was about 13 in 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and Mr Nagahara actually lived in Tokyo at that time. He was a schoolboy, obviously. Enormous devastation, and I think there's a name for the survivors of the Hiroshima and probably the Nagasaki bombs, and that's the hibakusha. So he is one of those. So he went to work in the Sailor Pen factory in 1946. Still a very young man, in fact a boy. He stayed there for his entire career, retiring in 2012, so that's a sort of 60, 70-year career. That's extraordinary. He rose to the top of his particular profession because the bit that he was involved in was making nibs. And he took this art to an extraordinarily high degree. And the Naginata Togi was, I think, one of the first specialist nibs that he created. Why did he create it? Well, the Japanese have a great interest in developing pens that will give variation in line width. And that's probably because that works well if you're attempting to write kanji with some style. So he started with this. He went on to create many other quite remarkable nibs, sometimes laying several nibs one on top of another to give massive line variation, from extremely fine lines to ludicrously broad lines. I've seen some of these pens and I've even used some of them. If you want massive line variation, there is little to beat them. And it's interesting that the approach that the Japanese tend to take with this is, on the whole, to work with the shape of the nib. I think in Europe we tend to go more for the flex nib to give variation in line width. There are benefits to both approaches actually. For copperplate, for instance, I think a flex nib will give you far better results than this sort of nib, shape nib, ever will. But there are other areas where actually changing the nib angle to the paper is going to work extremely well. Anyway, going back to Mr Nagahara, he retired, as I say, in 2012. Now, it wasn't a complete disaster because his son, Yukio, took over. However, he was not a young man, and he retired not many years later. And Sailor were left with a bit of a problem because although I'm sure they didn't make all of these nibs themselves, they certainly oversaw the process and clearly knew a huge amount about it. And I think it's taken them quite a while to train up people to produce these nibs to sufficient quality. And I've got to say the quality is enormously high. And also in sufficient amounts to meet the pent-up demand, because these pens, as I say, have not been available for some years. Now the price has absolutely shot up, and it's gone from below £1,000 now up to about £1,800. That's usually, now you can get it cheaper, and we do sell it a little bit less expensively than that. But wherever you buy, I think you're going to pay quite a lot for this pen. And I think probably what we ought to think about doing now is have a look at how it writes and see if that in any way justifies these prices. So I'm just going to switch off for a moment, rearrange the desk, and we'll come back with a drop of ink. Okay then, just going to have another quick look at the pen. As I said, right at the beginning, it is a fairly plain pen. There's not a lot of decoration on it. It is a cartridge converter pen. So this is a fairly standard size converter underneath all this beautiful metalwork. A fine looking thing, but if there is a criticism of these pens, it's that the ink capacity is not that great. But I think filling a pen like this is probably a huge pleasure actually. There we go. On this occasion I'm just going to dip it. There we go. Right, so I have a nice bottle here of Shikiori Yamadori ink, Sailor of course. There we go. A lovely colour. So now, as everyone knows, I have appalling handwriting, and reaching around this camera doesn't help it at all. But there we go. We'll see how we get on. So we will say this is a sailor. Oh, Naginata Togi nib. And that's giving us a fairly broad line. It can also give us a fairly fine line. See if I can spell this correctly. This Naginata Togi nib. There we go. Now let's have a look at this. Broad lines, much finer lines. There we go. It's a very pleasant writing experience. I'm not a person who likes very, very, very smooth nibs. I find they run away with me. There's a little bit of feedback that I'm getting here. This is Loitterm 1917. Again, a very nice paper. Probably not the absolute smoothest in the world, which I've got to admit, I like. So just running this through its paces. Now, as you see, I'm standing the pen up, and you get a very fine line. Actually, if you write on the back, you get an even finer line. But now I'm laying it down a bit. You're getting a broader line, laying it down even further, and the line gets broader. There we go. Now, applying a little bit of pressure, you can get a degree of flex as well. So this is fairly light. And just moving it a little bit further. There we are, let's try this again. Right, so bits of flex, a lot of variation due to the line angle. The broad line obviously coming across here, but again you stand it up and the line gets a bit thinner. Come down here, no pressure, come down here. No pressure, come down here, a little bit of pressure. So we're getting a degree of flex as well as variation due to the angle of the pen to the paper. Now, the question is, I suppose, is this pen worth the amount that one is asked to pay for it? Well, obviously, I wouldn't sell them if I didn't think they were. I think they're enormous pleasure to write with. As you've seen, my handwriting is not great, but I could happily play with this all day, actually. It's a It's a really nice pen to hold. It is a big pen. Because it's Ebonite, it's not a heavy pen. I mean, you know it's in your hand, but it's not a heavy pen by any stretch of the imagination, and certainly not as heavy as other pens that you might be asked to pay this sort of price for, because they would tend to be fairly ornate pens with lots of decoration and so forth, and maybe made of metal and consequently quite heavy. The simplicity of this pen, I think, is what wins it over for me. I love simple things. This is simple, but it's perfect. The nib, in fact, is very complicated. However, to use, again, it is very simple. Although, with practice and improving one's skills, you could have really impressive results from it. I am not a great calligrapher. In fact, I'm not a calligrapher at all. In fact, my handwriting is disgraceful. But I can get quite a lot out of this nib, as I'm sure you could if you decided to buy yourself a Sailor King of Pen in Ebonite with a Naginata Togi nib. And I should just be clear that this is the medium fine nib. It is available with a medium and broad nib as well. So you pays your money, you takes your choice. Thank you very much for watching this. If you enjoyed it, please give us a thumbs up, or even possibly subscribe to our channel. But for the time being, this is Here Pens and John Hall saying thank you very much indeed.